Lady Annalise Thorne decided to ruin her life on a Tuesday. It was not a grand, theatrical decision made in a fit of passion, but a quiet, curdled resolution that settled in her bones like the damp chill of her ancestral home. She had turned away countless suitors, each more bland and grasping than the last. She never imagined one of them would return holding the deed to everything she had ever known. But the man at her door that day was not a suitor. He was something far worse, a mirror to her own desperation. The rain had been falling for 3 days, a miserable, persistent weeping from a sky the colour of a fresh bruise. It drummed against the leaded glass of the study where Annalise wrestled with the estate ledgers, the columns of numbers a swarm of black ants marching toward a cliff. They were ruined. The word was a stone in her throat. Her father, bless his gentle poetic soul, had been a master of botany and a fool with finances. Upon his death, he had left her a legacy of prize-winning roses, an insurmountable debt. A sharp knock echoed from the great oak door at the front of the house. It was a sound of startling impertinence. No one called at Thorne Manor anymore, not unless they were delivering a final notice. Her housekeeper, Martha, was down with a fever, and Annalise was left to answer it herself. She pulled open the heavy door, a gust of wind snatching at her skirts and flinging icy rain against her face. A man stood on the stone step, a figure of utter destitution. He was tall, but stooped, his clothes little more than layered rags soaked through and clinging to a gaunt frame. Mud caked his worn boots and streaked his face, which was half hidden by a tangle of wet, dark hair and a rough beard. But it was his eyes that caught her. Beneath the grime and exhaustion, they were a startling, clear grey, and they held her gaze with an unnerving stillness. He did not speak at first, merely looked at her, a silent question in his steady gaze. The sight of him, so wretched and yet so composed, ignited a fury in Annalise. It was the fury of the trapped, the powerless. He was a physical embodiment of the poverty that was clawing at her own door. "What do you want?" she snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. His voice, when it came, was a low rasp roughened by the road. "A piece of bread, if you can spare it, and perhaps a moment out of this rain." Annalise laughed. It was a brittle, ugly sound that died like a candle running out of air. The pantry was nearly bare. The bread she had was stale, and she was saving it for her own supper. The injustice of it all, her noble lineage, her beautiful, crumbling home, and this beggar asking for the very thing she herself was terrified of losing, was too much. "Bread?" she repeated, the word dripping with scorn. "We are not a charity here. There is work to be had in the village for those not too lazy to seek it. Go earn your bread instead of begging for it at the doors of your betters." The words fell like stones into a frozen pond. The man's expression did not change, but something in the depths of those grey eyes flickered. It was not anger, not shame. It was appraisal. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for a long, silent moment. She felt a sudden, bizarre chill, as if he were seeing past the fraying silk of her gown and the proud tilt of her chin, straight into the panicked heart of her. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "My apologies for the intrusion, my lady," he said, his tone devoid of the subservience she expected. He turned without another word and walked back into the driving rain, his silhouette quickly swallowed by the gloom. Annalise slammed the door shut, the bolt shooting home with a deafening crack. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and her fingers, where she gripped the cold iron handle, were white at the knuckles. She told herself it was righteousness. She told herself she had done what was necessary. But as she leaned her forehead against the cool wood, the image of his still, grey eyes was burned into her mind. She had not felt like his better. she had felt small. Weeks passed. The rain eventually ceased, giving way to a pale, watery sun that did little to warm the chill of impending doom. The final notices arrived, as she knew they would. The mortgages on Thorn Manor and all its surrounding lands, held for generations by the old Duke of Alistair, were now in the hands of his heir. The old Duke had been a recluse, content to let his accounts languish. But whispers from the village spoke of the new Duke, a man of formidable reputation, known for his ruthless efficiency in London's financial circles. He was coming to inspect his inheritance. An invitation arrived, penned in a severe, elegant script. It was not a request, but a summons. The new Duke of Alistair would be receiving the local gentry at the ducal manor. Attendance was expected. Annalise stared at the heavy cream card, the ducal crest embossed in gold at the top. It felt like a death warrant. She wore her last presentable gown, a deep emerald silk that had been her mother's. It was slightly out of fashion, but it brought out the defiant green in her eyes. As she stood before the mirror, pinching her cheeks for colour, she practiced a look of detached indifference. She was Lady Annalise Thorn, and she would not be cowed. It was a lie, but it was the only armour she had. The ducal manor was a world away from her own crumbling home. It was a fortress of granite and glass, blazing with the light of 1,000 candles. Music spilled from the open ballroom doors, a golden river of sound. The air buzzed with nervous energy. Everyone was here to see the new wolf in their midst, to gauge the length of his teeth. Annalise entered the ballroom on the arm of a distant cousin, a portly man whose main concern was the location of the refreshments. Her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for the man who held her future in his hands. And then she saw him. He stood near the grand fireplace, a glass of wine in his hand, listening to the fawning Lord Ashworth. He was nothing like the ragged traveller. This man was power personified. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored coat of black, superfine wool that made every other man in the room look like a provincial caricature. His dark hair was neatly styled, his face clean-shaven, revealing a strong jaw and a mouth that looked as if it had never formed a smile. He was devastatingly handsome, in a severe, intimidating way. He turned his head then, as if sensing her gaze. His eyes swept over the crowd, cool and dismissive, until they landed on her. They stopped. For a heart-stopping second, the entire ballroom, with its music and chatter, faded into a dull roar. His eyes, they were the same startling clear grey, the same unnerving stillness. Annalise's breath caught in her throat. A cold dread, sharp and swift, pierced through her. It could not be. It was a trick of the light, a phantom of her guilty conscience. It was impossible. He excused himself from Lord Ashworth with a curt nod, and began to move through the crowd. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that was somehow more commanding than any swagger. The crowd parted for him as if by magic. He was coming toward her. Her cousin, seeing the Duke's approach, began to stammer and bow. Annalise stood frozen, her carefully constructed composure shattering like thin ice. He stopped before her, his height casting a shadow over her. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable. The bone structure, the line of his brow, it was all there, sharpened and refined, but unmistakably the same. "Lady Annalise Thorn," he said. His voice was not the rasp she remembered, but a deep, cultured baritone. Yet the cadence held a faint echo of the man on her doorstep. "I am Alistair, Duke of Blackwood." She managed a curtsy, her movements stiff and jerky. "Your Grace," she murmured, her own voice a stranger's. He did not smile. His gaze was intense, analytical. "I have been reviewing the accounts for my new estate," he said, his voice dropping slightly, meant for her ears alone. "There are a number of irregularities, particularly concerning the Thorn property." Her blood ran cold. This was it. This was her ruin, delivered in a ballroom, wrapped in polite words. "I find myself in need of a comprehensive catalogue of the Thorn Library," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "I am told it is extensive. I will call upon you tomorrow morning to discuss the matter." It was not a request. It was a command. He held her gaze for another moment, a moment that stretched into an eternity. And in the cool grey depths of his eyes, she saw it. A flicker of memory. A silent acknowledgement of the rain, the wretchedness, the scorn. He knew. He remembered everything. Then he gave a slight, formal bow and turned away, leaving her standing in the middle of the crowded room, her heart a frantic bird trapped in the cage of her ribs. The man she had mocked, the beggar she had turned away with nothing but contempt, had come back, and he owned her world. The next morning arrived with a sense of grim inevitability. Annalise had not slept. She had spent the night pacing her bedchamber, the Duke's face swimming before her eyes. First the ragged traveller, then the imperious nobleman. They were two sides of a coin she could not comprehend. She dressed with defiant care in a simple grey morning gown, her hair coiled neatly at the nape of her neck. She would face him not as a supplicant, but as the lady of the manor, however tenuous her claim to that title now was. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. He arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, his carriage a gleaming black lacquer shell drawn by two magnificent black horses. He was alone. He entered the house, his presence seeming to shrink the already cavernous, sparsely furnished hall. He glanced around, his expression unreadable, taking in the faded tapestries and the worn marble floors. Annalise led him to the library. It was her father's sanctuary, the one room in the house that had been perfectly maintained. 2 stories of books rose to a vaulted ceiling, the air thick with the scent of old paper and leather. It was the only real treasure they had left. "As you can see, Your Grace, the collection is substantial," she said, her voice cool and steady. She refused to let it tremble. He walked slowly along a shelf, his gloved fingers trailing lightly over the spines of the books. He did not seem to be looking at the titles, but rather absorbing the atmosphere of the room. "Indeed," he said, his back still to her. "My father spoke of it. He said it was the finest private collection in the county." He turned to face her, his expression as remote as a winter sky. "The debts on this estate, Lady Annalise, are equally substantial. In fact, they are overwhelming. By my calculation, you are bankrupt." The word hung in the silent air between them. Annalise lifted her chin. "We are aware of our circumstances, Your Grace." "Are you?" he asked softly. He took a step closer. "Because I could have you and your household removed by nightfall. The law is entirely on my side." Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Then why have you not done so? Why this pretense about cataloguing a library you intend to seize anyway? Is this some sort of game? A drawn-out revenge for a perceived slight?" She had said it. The accusation was out, sharp and dangerous. She expected him to lash out, to confirm her worst fears. Instead, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. "Revenge is a tedious and unproductive pastime, my lady," he said calmly. "I am a man of business. I am here with a proposition. Annalise waited, her breath held tight in her chest. "I will suspend all collection of your debts," he said, his gaze unwavering. "You will continue to live here, as mistress of Thorn Manor. In exchange, you will undertake a task for me. I am restoring the ducal library. It has been neglected for decades. I require someone with an intimate knowledge of literature, preservation, and organization to oversee the project. I require you." She stared at him, bewildered. Of all the things she had expected, eviction, ruin, a forced marriage, this was not one of them. It was absurd. A punishment disguised as employment. A way to keep her under his thumb, to remind her daily of her precarious position. "You wish for me to be your librarian?" she asked, the words tasting like ash. "I wish for you to be the director of the library's restoration," he corrected smoothly. "You will have a staff, a budget. You will report directly and only to me. Those are my terms. Accept them and your home is safe. Refuse, and I will be forced to act as any other creditor would." She had no choice. It was a gilded cage, but it was infinitely better than being cast out onto the street. He was binding her to him with invisible chains of debt and obligation. "I accept," she said, the words feeling like a surrender. "Excellent," he replied, a faint, almost imperceptible hint of satisfaction in his tone. "You will begin on Monday. I will send a carriage for you each morning at 9. He turned and walked toward the door, his purpose fulfilled. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at her. "And Lady Annalise," he added, his voice low, "do not mistake my pragmatism for kindness. You are in my employ now. I expect diligence." He left her standing alone amidst the books that had once been her refuge and were now the instrument of her bondage. The chill she had felt on her doorstep weeks ago returned, settling deep within her. She was a fly caught in a spider's web, and the spider was a patient, unreadable duke who remembered the sting of her laughter. The first week of her new employment was a trial of silent tension. Each morning, the duke's carriage arrived, a stark black reminder of her servitude. She would be driven to the ducal manor, where she was met by a stern-faced head housekeeper, who showed her to the library with the air of a jailer leading a prisoner to their cell. The library was a cavern of chaos. Decades of neglect had left books piled in precarious stacks, covered in sheets of dusty linen. The air was stale, and cobwebs draped the high, arched windows like funeral shrouds. It was a monumental task, but Annalise felt a flicker of something other than dread. Here, at least, was a problem she could solve. It was a world of order waiting to be born from chaos, a welcome distraction from the disorder of her own life. She saw the Duke only fleetingly. He would appear at unpredictable moments, standing silently in the doorway, watching her work. He never spoke, merely observed, his grey eyes taking in her progress before he would turn and leave as quietly as he had arrived. His presence was a constant, unnerving weight at the edge of her awareness. She felt like a specimen under glass. Annalise threw herself into the work, her mind focused on the familiar comfort of classification and order. She directed the small staff of footmen and maids he had assigned her with a crisp efficiency that belied her inner turmoil. Slowly, painstakingly, the room began to transform. Sunlight, for the first time in years, streamed through clean windows, illuminating swirling dust motes like tiny dancing spirits. One afternoon, while she was carefully examining a fragile, water-damaged folio, he entered the room and did not leave. He walked over to the table where she worked, his shadow falling over the ancient pages. "The damage is extensive," he remarked, his voice startlingly close. "It is," Annalise replied, not looking up. "But I believe the text can be saved. The vellum is resilient. He stood beside her, watching her gentle fingers trace the faded ink. His proximity was unsettling. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, smell the faint, clean scent of soap and wool. Her heart began a slow, heavy beat. "You have a passion for this," he stated. It was not a question. "My father taught me," she said, her voice tight. "He believed books were living things, that they held the souls of those who wrote them." A strange silence fell between them. She dared a glance up at him. His expression was unguarded for a fraction of a second, a deep-seated melancholy in his eyes that took her by surprise. It was a crack in the marble facade, a glimpse of something vulnerable beneath. He seemed to catch himself, his features settling back into their usual remote cast. "I have acquired a new collection," he said, his tone once again all business. "From the estate of Lord Ellington. It arrives tomorrow. I trust you will find a place for it." Before she could reply, he was gone. Annalise stared at the empty doorway, her fingers resting on the cool vellum. A passion for this. He saw that. He saw a part of her she thought was invisible to him. The realization was as disturbing as it was intriguing. The Ellington collection arrived, and with it, a new challenge. Annalise found herself working later and later, often missing the carriage that was meant to take her home. On those evenings, she would walk the few miles back to Thorn Manor, the cool night air a balm on her frayed nerves. One evening, as she was preparing to leave, a storm broke with sudden violence. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled around the corners of the manor. She stood in the grand hall, hesitating. The walk home was impossible in such weather. "You will not be walking home in this," the Duke's voice said from the top of the main staircase. She looked up to see him descending, dressed not in his formal attire, but in a simple shirt and dark trousers. He looked younger, less formidable. "A room has been prepared for you," he said. "You will stay the night." The thought of sleeping under his roof, a guest by decree, sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. "That is not necessary, Your Grace. The storm will pass." "It will not," he said simply. "I will not have you catch your death on my account. You are too valuable to my library." The words were pragmatic, impersonal, yet they held a strange undercurrent of concern. She was an asset to be protected. Still, it was a form of care. Reluctantly, she agreed. The room she was given was luxurious, with a roaring fire and a bed so large and soft it felt sinful. But sleep eluded her. She was restless, her mind churning. Hours later, thirsty, she crept out of her room in search of the kitchens. The house was dark and silent, save for the storm raging outside. As she passed the Duke's private study, she saw a thin sliver of light from under the door. She heard a sound, the distinct clink of glass against glass. Curiosity, sharp and unwelcome, got the better of her. She pushed the door open a crack and peered inside. The Duke of Alistair was sitting in a large leather chair before the fire, a decanter of brandy on the table beside him. He was staring into the flames, his face etched with a profound loneliness that struck her to the core. He looked like a king in a silent, empty kingdom. He seemed to sense her presence, his head turning sharply toward the door. Their eyes met across the dimly lit room. He did not look angry at the intrusion. He looked weary. "I could not sleep," she whispered, feeling like a fool. He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Nor I," he said. "Join me." Hesitantly, she entered the room and sat down, perching on the edge of the velvet cushion. He poured a small amount of brandy into a glass and pushed it toward her. She took it, her fingers trembling slightly. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the drumming of the rain. It was not an awkward silence, but a strangely companionable one. "You do not belong here," he said suddenly, his voice quiet. Annalise stiffened. "I am well aware of that, Your Grace." "That is not what I meant," he said, turning his gaze from the fire to her. "I have seen you with your books. Your face changes. You come alive. You do not belong in a world of debt and ledgers and crumbling estates. You belong among stories." Her throat tightened. No one had ever said anything so perceptive to her. No one had ever seen past her sharp tongue and proud defenses to the woman beneath. "And where do you belong, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. A shadow passed over his features. "I belong here," he said, and the words sounded like a life sentence. "Among the ledgers and the duties. This is my inheritance." In that moment, she did not see a powerful duke, her creditor, her tormentor. She saw a man as trapped by his circumstances as she was by hers. A crack in the armor had appeared, and through it, she saw a flash of the lonely man within. It was a dangerous, terrifying, and utterly compelling sight. The fragile truce forged in the firelight of the Duke's study did not last. The world outside the manor walls soon intruded, its petty cruelties sharp and persistent. As Annalise's daily trips to the ducal manor became routine, tongues in the village began to wag. Whispers followed her in the market, speculating on the nature of her employment. The chief purveyor of these rumors was Lady Beatrice Croft, a woman whose own aspirations toward the new duke had been soundly ignored. Beatrice, with her sharp nose and sharper smile, saw in Annalise a rival to be dismantled. The whispers grew into a steady hum of gossip that eventually reached the ears of Annalise's aunt, her mother's sister, who descended upon Thorn Manor in a flurry of outrage and smelling salts. "Annalise, you must put a stop to this at once," Aunt Helen declared, fanning herself vigorously though the drawing room was cool. "Working for him? Unchaperoned? People are saying the most dreadful things. They say you are his creature." "I am his librarian," Annalise corrected, her voice tight with restrained anger. "And I am saving our home. Would you rather we were living in the street?" "There are worse things than poverty, child," her aunt sniffed. "A sullied reputation is a stain that never washes out." The conversation left a bitter taste in Annalise's mouth. It was a reminder that even in her gilded cage, the bars were still there, forged by society's expectations. The conflict came to a head at a garden party hosted by Lord and Lady Ashworth. It was the first major social event of the season, and Annalise knew her attendance was a necessity. She needed to show the world she was unbowed. The Duke was there, of course, a formidable, solitary figure who commanded attention simply by his stillness. He acknowledged her with a curt, public nod, his expression giving nothing away. Annalise was attempting to navigate the treacherous waters near the lemonade table when Beatrice Croft cornered her. "Lady Annalise," Beatrice began, her voice sweet as poison. "How wonderful to see you out and about. One hears you are kept so very busy these days. At the manor." Annalise's fingers tightened around her glass. "The Duke's library is extensive. It requires a great deal of attention." Beatrice laughed, a high, tinkling sound that drew the attention of those nearby. "Oh, I am certain it does. I imagine a man like the Duke has many extensive assets that require a woman's personal touch." The insinuation was vile and unmistakable. A wave of hot fury washed over Annalise. She opened her mouth to deliver a scathing retort, to put Beatrice firmly in her place. But a calm, low voice cut through the air before she could speak. "Lady Beatrice." The Duke of Alistair stood just behind Annalise. He had moved with such silence, she had not even heard his approach. His face was a mask of cold displeasure, and his grey eyes were chips of ice. Beatrice Croft paled, her smug smile faltering. Your Grace, we were just... I heard precisely what you would just, he said, his voice dangerously soft. You are speaking of Lady Annalise Thorne, who is undertaking a scholarly project of immense importance to the preservation of this county's history. A project for which I, and my estate, are deeply indebted to her. He took a deliberate step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Annalise, a subtle but clear protective barrier. Her reputation is, therefore, an extension of my own. I would advise you to remember that. Should I hear such baseless, malicious slander again, you will find that the social circles of this county, and indeed of London, have become permanently closed to you. The threat was delivered without a single raised decibel, yet it carried the force of a thunderclap. The small crowd that had gathered to watch the drama melted away, suddenly fascinated by distant hedges and cloud formations. Beatrice Croft looked as if she had been struck. She mumbled a horrified apology and fled. Annalise stood in the sudden silence, her heart pounding. He had defended her, not with ambiguity or polite redirection, but with the full, crushing weight of his title and power. He had shielded her completely. He turned to her, the ice in his eyes thawing slightly as they met hers. Are you all right? She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. Come, he said, offering her his arm. Let us walk. The air in here has become rather stale. She laid her hand tentatively on his arm, the fine wool of his coat solid and real beneath her fingers. As he led her away from the gossiping crowd and toward the quiet seclusion of the rose garden, her mind was a whirlwind. This act went far beyond that of an employer protecting an asset. This was personal. It was a gesture of profound, startling chivalry from a man she had believed capable of none. The confusion she felt toward him was deepening, twisting into a knot of fear, gratitude, and a bewildering, terrifying flicker of attraction. He was her captor, and now he was her champion. The contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. The walk in the rose garden was a silent affair. The Duke seemed content to let the quiet settle, giving her time to compose herself. But for Annalise, the silence was a breeding ground for questions. The incident with Lady Beatrice had been a turning point. His defense of her had been too swift, too absolute. It was the act of a man with a personal stake, and she could no longer endure the torment of not knowing what that stake was. Back at Thorne Manor that evening, the memory of his words, of the solid feel of his arm beneath her hand, played over and over in her mind. She could not continue this way, living in a state of suspended animation, a pawn in his inscrutable game. She needed the truth, whatever the cost. The next day, she did not wait for him to appear in the library. After hours of wrestling with her courage, she went in search of him. She found him in his study, the same room where they had shared brandy during the storm. He was seated at his large desk, immersed in a sea of papers. She knocked on the open door, and he looked up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Lady Annalise. Your Grace, may I have a word with you? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. He gestured to the chair she had occupied once before. Of course. She did not sit. She remained standing, needing the illusion of control. I must thank you for your intervention yesterday. It was unexpected. Lady Beatrice was behaving reprehensibly, he said, his tone dismissive, as if it were a matter of little consequence. It required correction. It was more than that, Annalise insisted, taking a step closer to the desk. And this arrangement, this work in your library, it is more than just a business transaction. I am no fool, Your Grace. I have felt your eyes on me from the beginning. I see the way you watch me, I need to know why. She paused, her heart hammering. Why are you doing this? Why not just cast my family out? Is this all some elaborate, cruel revenge for a few harsh words spoken in the rain? She finally asked the question that had haunted her for weeks. Tell me the truth. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady and intense. He did not deny it. I remember that day, he said, his voice low and resonant. I remember every word you said. Annalise braced herself for the triumphant confession, the final cruel twist of the knife. You want the truth? He continued, his eyes holding hers captive. The truth is, I was not a beggar. I was to inherit a title and lands I had never seen, filled with people who would only ever see the dukedom, not the man. I was told my tenants was suffering, that the estate was mismanaged. So I chose to walk my lands, to see them with my own eyes, to speak to the people not as a duke, but as a man with nothing. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, staring out at the manicured lawns. I spent a month on the road. I was met with suspicion, with pity, with feigned charity. I was given scraps from back doors by people who would later bow and scrape if they knew who I was. It was a disheartening exercise in human hypocrisy. He turned back to face her, his expression raw and unguarded. And then I came to your door. I was cold, hungry, and utterly disillusioned with the world I was about to inherit. And you looked at me with fire in your eyes. You did not offer me pity. You offered me scorn. You laughed at me. Annalise flinched, the shame of her actions washing over her anew. I was cruel, she whispered. You were, he agreed, without heat. But you were also the first person who was honest. You saw a wretch, and you told him exactly what you thought of him. You were not afraid. In that moment, your harsh words were more real, more vital, than all the cloying pleasantries I had endured for weeks. You were not looking at a title or a purse. You were looking at a man, and you found him wanting. He took a step toward her, his voice dropping even lower. Your laughter stung, yes, but it also intrigued me. When I saw you again in the ballroom, I realized the woman with the fire in her eyes was the same woman drowning in her father's debts. I could have ruined you. It would have been simple. Then why didn't you? She breathed, her entire being focused on his next words. Because ruining you would mean losing you, he confessed, the admission stark and profound in the quiet room. This arrangement, the library, it was a clumsy, desperate pretext. A way to keep you close. A way to see if the fire I saw that day was real. I told myself it was a punishment, a test. But I was lying. I was simply a lonely, guarded man who had found something genuine and had no idea how to approach it, except through the power he had always known. He stood before her now, stripped of his ducal armor, his vulnerability laid bare. This was never about revenge, Annalise, he said, using her given name for the first time. It sounded both strange and deeply familiar on his lips. It was about you. The confession hung in the air, shattering every assumption she had ever made about him. He was not a vengeful tyrant. He was not a cold-hearted creditor. He was a man who had been so starved for authenticity that he had mistaken her cruelty for it. He had seen a spark in her during her darkest moment, and had orchestrated this entire charade not to punish her, but to keep that spark within his orbit. Annalise stared at him, at the man now fully revealed to her. The anger and fear she had harbored for weeks dissolved, washed away by a sudden, overwhelming wave of empathy. She saw the profound loneliness in his confession, the isolation that his title had built around him like a fortress. Her own pride, her own defensive cruelty, suddenly seemed childish in comparison. Shame warred with a startling sense of connection. He had seen her at her absolute worst, and it had been the catalyst for his fascination. He had not seen a lady brought low, but a spirit refusing to break. "You have been alone for a very long time," she said, the words a soft realization rather than a question. A shadow of pain crossed his features. "A title is a lonely inheritance," he admitted. He took a final step, closing the small distance between them. The air crackled with unspoken words, with weeks of tension and misunderstanding. He looked down at her, his grey eyes searching her face, filled with a desperate hope. "The debt is forgiven," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was never the point. You are free to go, Annalise. You can walk out of this house, out of this arrangement, and never see me again. Your home is yours, with no strings attached. The choice is finally, truly yours." He was giving her back her power. He was offering her an escape, an end to the entire affair. She could accept it, return to her crumbling manor, and live her life in quiet solitude, free from his influence. It was everything she thought she wanted. But as she looked up into his face, into the eyes of the man who had seen her so clearly, she knew that walking away would be the loneliest act of her life. The gilded cage had become a sanctuary of sorts, the place where she was not just Lady Annalise Thorne, but the woman who brought order from chaos, the woman with a passion for stories, the place where someone finally saw her. She did not walk away. Instead, she raised her hand and gently, tentatively, laid her palm against his cheek. The skin was warm, the faint roughness of his jaw a startlingly intimate texture beneath her fingertips. He closed his eyes at her touch, a shudder passing through his powerful frame. It was a gesture of complete surrender. "And what if I don't want to go?" she whispered. His eyes opened, and in their depths she saw a raw, unguarded vulnerability that stole her breath. He slowly lowered his head, giving her every chance to retreat. She stood her ground. When his lips met hers, it was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of profound relief, a quiet question and a silent answer all in one. It was gentle, hesitant, and filled with the sorrow of lost time and the hopeful promise of a new beginning. It was the closing of one chapter and the tender, uncertain opening of another. In that single cathartic moment, the beggar, the duke, and the lonely man all disappeared, leaving only Alistair. And for the first time, Annalise felt truly, completely free. 6 months later, the first snow of winter dusted the grounds of the ducal manor, blanketing the world in a soft, forgiving white. From the window of the now immaculate library, Annalise watched the delicate flakes drift down. A cheerful fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, golden glow over the endless rows of books, each one now perfectly catalogued and shelved. The room was no longer just a place of work. It was the heart of her new home. A deep sense of peace had settled within her, a feeling she had long thought impossible. The library doors opened, and Alistair entered, carrying 2 cups of steaming tea. The severe, remote Duke of Blackwood was gone. In his place was a man whose smile reached his eyes, chasing away the last of the shadows. He had shed the weight of his title in her presence, becoming simply the man who loved stories and the woman who cared for them. "I thought you might be getting cold," he said, handing her a cup. His fingers brushed against hers, a simple, familiar touch that sent a pleasant warmth through her veins. "I was just thinking," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder as he stood beside her at the window, "about the day you came to my door." He grew still. "Do you think of it often?" "Sometimes," she admitted. I think of how angry and frightened I was, and how I almost let my pride close the door on my entire future. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. And I think of how I was a fool, using power and intimidation because I had forgotten how to simply speak to another person. We were a rather sorry pair, you and I. She laughed, a genuine happy sound that filled the quiet room. A very sorry pair indeed. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the snow fall. Her life was unrecognizable from the one she had been living less than a year ago. The debts on Thorn Manor were gone, and her ancestral home was being lovingly restored, not as her cage, but as a cherished piece of her past. She was no longer a lady on the verge of ruin, but a duchess who had found her purpose and her partner in the most unlikely of ways. It was never too late, she realized, to begin again. A person's worth was not defined by their title or their wealth, but by the courage to be seen for who they truly are. She had turned away a man in rags, a man she judged unworthy. But love, in its infinite patience, had come back, dressed as a duke, to prove her wrong. And she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for that rainy, miserable, wonderful Tuesday.